welcome to the CNSS podcast. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and I'm a non resident visiting fellow at the Center for National Security Studies at Ramaya University. You will be familiar with our guest for today's episode, Dr. Sean Turnell. Professor Turnell is an honorary professor of economics at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He was previously a senior economic analyst at the Reserve Bank of Australia, a policy advisor to a range of international institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. You may remember that between 2016 and 2021, Dr. Turnell worked as an economic advisor to the government of Aung San Suu Kyi and continued to advise her after she was overthrown in a coup in February 2021. In episode 10 of the CNSS podcast, Sean and I spoke about his own imprisonment for 650 days in Myanmar at the hands of the military junta. On today's episode, Sean joins us to discuss relations between the US and Myanmar. Under the current Trump administration, foreign policy has again shifted to perpetually put America first. On January 20th of this year, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing a 90-day freeze on all US assistance. This has particularly hit organizations like the US Energy for International Development or USAID, which used to administer most of America's foreign aid. In 2020, this was approximately 61% of $71 billion, which was USAID's total budget. In Myanmar's case, this has particularly been felt by networks that oppose the military junta. Things have compounded since March 28th, when a 7.7 magnitude earthquake in Myanmar struck and killed thousands. However, the US did provide aid. They pledged a total of $7 million for emergency shelter, food, medical care, and water. On the other hand, CNN reported that the US sent only a paltry amount of assistance and only 3 workers who were then subsequently fired while they were on ground in Myanmar providing assistance. Considering all these factors, we also need to zoom out a little bit. How are policymakers in the US, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or the bipartisan US Congress, thinking about the situation in Myanmar? What does it mean for actors like Russia and China? And are there takeaways for Quad partners like India and Australia? Listen in as Sean and I tackle some of these questions head on. Hi, Sean. Welcome back to the CNSS podcast. We're really happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back.
Wonderful. I know that you visited the United States of America recently and you engaged with policymakers from the Republican Party, mostly, if I'm not wrong. What was your experience being back in the US? I don't know if you've been back recently, but I thought we could start there. How was it to be back and talk to American policymakers after the recent election?
Yeah, so the whole objective of the trip was really to introduce myself in the policy area to the new Trump administration. So I'd been to the United States many, many times on Myanmar issues. And of course, the US had actually played quite a big role in getting me released from Burma a few years ago. So have lots of US friends in policy circles. But this was the first time I'd been back with the Trump administration in place. And I was particularly interested in trying to take their temperature, just where were they when it come to Myanmar, and was it possible to influence them in any way? A little bit of firefighting as well, to be honest, because before I went, in fact, I think the day that I left Sydney, the big dispute that took place in the Oval Office between President Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President Vance took place. So there was a lot of I guess, anxiety around. And so I was interested just to find, were there any particular problems that I needed to address? Were there any issues that I thought might blow up in a similar way? So it was very much a sort of attempt, if you like, just to take the temperature of the new administration and see where we could make progress.
So what was that temperature like, particularly with respect to Myanmar? Could you see a shift in the way they were thinking compared to the Biden administration or even the first Trump administration?
It's interesting because Myanmar has always been a bipartisan issue in the US. So I wasn't expecting a big change in official Washington. Where I thought there might be change was within the Trump administration itself, and in particular in the people around the president. And that is more or less how I found things. So in other words, in official Washington, that is, in the State Department, in Treasury, even in the National Security Council, the think tanks, the diplomatic foreign policy community, if you like, there was a lot of continuity. So I'd say that the basic consensus was, as it is in most parts of the world, that the junta that's ruling Myanmar is not only brutal and so on, but is actually making profound errors when it comes to international policy making, when it comes to the economy, things like that. So, so I found that more or less continued from the Biden administration, and that bipartisanship that I mentioned earlier was pretty much in evidence still. So that was very much in official Washington. With the Trump administration itself, I was only able to partially penetrate where their thinking was, I think. So I came away with the impression that they likewise held a dim view of the junta ruling Myanmar, were not particularly expert in the country or its issues, were inclined, if you like, to follow the more traditional official Washington. But I also had the feeling all the way through it that one had to take care that some sort of policy adventurism might be on the offing at any moment, you know. So I was at pains to see as many people from the administration as possible and get across, you know, some narrative, I guess, and some data about Myanmar that I thought they may not know, so that if, you know, decisions were in the offing, that they could make some informed decisions. So, so interesting in that, lots of continuity, but that continuity mostly in evidence in the circles in Washington that you would expect it to be. The X factor remains Trump and the people around him, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with President Trump, there's a element of unpredictability, whether it's projected or not, and that's something that we wonder how it affects like particular areas that we're looking at, particularly foreign policy. But I'm also curious because there was supported for Aung San Suu Kyi's government from the U.S. And so, in terms of the junta, do you see a change in how they're viewing it? Of course, I think there is a general idea that the US takes, that is that the military junta's rule is not good for the country. But beyond sort of statements, what is the sentiment of how are they reading it?
Yeah, so the sentiment on the junta and on Aung San Suu Kyi in the previous government remains more or less the same. I would say there's a great horror actually at what's been happening in Myanmar. Great concern about Aung San Suu Kyi personally, because she was very much a favourite amongst US politicians, in particular the former leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, but other people more broadly. There's a very strong pro-democracy in Myanmar caucus in the US Congress, and they're the people within the Congress that pay most attention to the country. So so from them you get the same sort of response as always of, you know, very great concern, and also I think quite trying to devise policy to bring about change in Myanmar. So that hasn't changed. So just on that front, City, well, I guess the big thing going on was that the Burma Act was being reintroduced to the Congress while I was over there, and under that act were a number of provisions relating to Myanmar, but in particular a series of sanctions against some of Myanmar's banks. A provision for the appointment of a special representative of the president, and various other things that were mostly amounted to sanctioning some state-owned enterprises and some people within the ruling junta. So that stick, if you like, of US policy towards Myanmar more or less remained. So in talking to the Congress, there was a fairly high degree, I think, of commitment to that. In many ways, Congress reflects a broad constituency in favour of those sorts of policies as well. That there's a reasonably substantial Burmese community that lives in the United States, and particularly well organised are people from some of Myanmar's ethnic nationalities, some of the minority groups that are particularly targeted by the junta. But they are often concentrated in particular US states. As I mentioned, they're particularly politically well organised. So they have quite a say, I think, when it comes to US policy towards Myanmar. And so you see this in that bill that I mentioned that's making its way through Congress, but in all sorts of other areas as well. So, yeah, so I think that traditional concern for Suu Kyi, concern of what the junta is doing, and concern, I think, more broadly where Myanmar is going is very much still reflected in the Congress, but then broadly as well. I might also mention another thing, Hamsini, that came up very strongly, and that is, of course, a great concern about the inroads being made by China in Myanmar. So as we know, since the coup took place, China's influence over Myanmar, and in particular the potential use of Myanmar for the purposes of Belt and Road Initiative, and even as a place via which to access the Bay of Bengal and ultimately the Indian Ocean, etc., is very strong and very much a focus, as I say, of US concerns. So I think the US concerns in Myanmar are not just related to human rights issues and sort of some of the traditional concerns, but there's very much that strategic element there as well.
It's very interesting because the last factor that you spoke about, which is China, I think Min Aung Hlaing just went to China over the weekend on May 10th. And it's interesting also because he'd visited Russia about 2 weeks ago. And it's clear that he's, courting as many partners as he could get. But I want to contextualize this a little bit and say, there was a devastating earthquake that happened in Myanmar in March. And there have been reports of airstrikes and continuing attacks by the military junta, even though there was a ceasefire declared. So, considering all of these dynamics, since you just went to the US and that's been the focus of our conversation, how do you see US policymakers sort of navigating this in the last couple of months?
Yeah, it's been a complex last few months because of the very factors that you mentioned. So while I was there, the earthquake took place, and initially the response to that was, well, first of grave concern, of course, because many thousands of people have been killed, many residential and other buildings destroyed, critical infrastructure destroyed. And so on top of the conflict going on in the country, and along with that, the collapsing economy more broadly, it just means that the situation in Myanmar is ever more dire. One of the big issues that came up in the wake of the earthquake and in the wake of Trump's dismantling of US AID was, of course, criticism of the response of the US itself to the earthquake specifically. So, in the past, we could have always relied on the US to be first in and to be in boots and all, and with substantial equipment, substantial assistance. That didn't happen this time. In fact, in the end, only about 3 individuals from USAID made their way into Myanmar, and they were actually relieved of their jobs in the middle of that assignment. So the US contribution to that end was really minimal, and that attracted a lot of attention at the time and a lot of criticism of the time. So the earthquake was certainly one element to that. That, of course, always there's complexities in Myanmar, and in response to the earthquake, there's also an alternative aspect to it, of course, which is that many groups, particularly those opposing the junta, are very anxious that assistance doesn't end up in the hands of the military, because the military do have a long track record of exploiting natural disasters and exploiting international assistance that they often just garner for themselves, and use episodes like that to sort of carve out some legitimacy. So the earthquake caused a lot of complexities, I think, in US thinking towards Myanmar, of which was one component, though, was a high degree of criticism of the Trump administration, for not supplying much in the way of assistance. So yeah, so the earthquake was a, you know, as I say, very much a complicating factor. On the broad security aspect, of course, this whole period, the last few months, have been a period of great tension with respect to the US, with respect to the actions of China and Russia and so on. And as you mentioned, just last week, of course, was the commemoration of the end of the Second World War. There was that great parade in Moscow. The junta leader in Myanmar, Min Aung Hlaing, was invited to that parade. And so he met with Vladimir Putin. He met with Xi Jinping of China and a number of other countries that were at that commemoration. So we had lots of images. For the first time, to some extent, actually. In fact, it's the first time since the coup that Min Aung Hlaing met Xi Jinping on the edges of that particular meeting. So the internet and the press, etc., were flooded with images of Min Aung Hlaing and Xi Jinping and Min Aung Hlaing and other world leaders. So yeah, as you said, he actually used the opportunity as a way of sort of projecting himself a little bit on the world stage. Having said that, though, of course, that particular gathering was very limited. You know, so most of the countries that are unhappy with what the junta has been doing in Myanmar, of course, were not a party to that. But yeah, all of that did sort of colour, I think, some of the reactions in the US.
Yeah, it's interesting because I also thought that that appearance and that visit was very much a diplomatic one in some ways, and to sort of maybe get more legitimacy for the military government. I'm also, when we're talking about US aid and we're thinking about all of these cuts to its budget, to personnel, to humanitarian aid, there is sort of the short-term complicating factor with what happened on the earthquake. But what about medium-term changes? What about long-term impacts? What do you think sort of the dismantling of the US aid ecosystem does in Myanmar?
The dismantling of US aid as it relates to Myanmar is really unfortunate because even though the aid was not much of it was going in the country since the coup. Nonetheless, there were quite a number of long-term development projects that were still going on, and in particular, support for Myanmar people in country, but also outside of the country. So yeah, in developing policy and in a sense in readiness for a return to a better political climate in Myanmar. So yeah, it was regarded, I think, as unfortunate by many people with an interest in the country and who were appreciating what the work of USAID was.
I was just thinking about how it's, yeah, difficult to sort of sustain these. And the dismantling of US aid also means that if there is sort of an interruption to its functioning, it's very difficult for aid agencies to pick up. And most of the time, it means that they have to start over afresh.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And there was extraordinary expertise within USAID towards Myanmar. I personally knew a great number of people within USAID and like a lot of people when it relates to Myanmar, many of them, you know, just were absolutely devoted to the country, had acquired immense knowledge of the place and would have been incredibly useful assets, you know, come the time for reconstruction in Myanmar. So, yeah, really unfortunate, I think.
I want to zoom out a little because we've spoken sort of about the recent context of what's happening, as well as how US policymakers are thinking about Myanmar. And now, if we zoom out a little bit, I think what we see is that Trump has a more transactional, less interventionist approach in a sense. So they're talking about targeted sanctions, very limited engagement with the military junta. They're talking about engaging with China and the Chinese sphere of influence. So overall, how do you see risks and opportunities for the US on one hand, and how do you see the resistance movement in Myanmar responding and dealing with this changing balance of power in the region?
It's a great phrase that you introduced, risks and opportunities, because that was uppermost in my mind as I thought about the whole transactional approach of the Trump administration. So it gives all parties, I think, opportunities to, engage in transactions and bring Donald Trump and therefore US policy on board. But of course, it also raises great dangers, because what could be an opportunity for one party could be a great risk for the next. So throughout the whole time I was sort of engaging with policymakers in the US, I kept on thinking about how it could be possible that the junta itself might seek transactions, with the US administration, and sort of go around, if you like, decades of policy in the US, and just strike a deal. The risk of that was always on my mind, particularly over things like rare earths, for instance, where Myanmar, and this is not a subject known to many people, but just about half of the rare earths processed in China actually come from Myanmar. They're sort of, through formal channels, but also informal channels, that they're taken from Myanmar to China. So one fears some sort of deal on that front, or many other fronts, that the regime could suddenly engage with Trump on. So that was sort of in my mind the whole time. But of course, that's also an opportunity for the forces against the junta as well, because one of the other facts about rare earths or critical minerals in Myanmar is that they're mostly in areas under the control of the democratic opposition. So in a sense, there's an opportunity, therefore, opens for those groups to actually engage in a transactional way with the Trump administration. So, just on that one topic alone of rare earths or critical minerals, you've got risks and opportunities both sides. And on almost every issue, you could see that sort of dichotomy, that it could be good or it could be bad, depending on, what player you were representing. Risks and opportunities just all around, based on that very transactional approach. But it did mean that throughout the whole experience that I had, but I know other people as well, one constantly has to bear in mind, the traditions of policy, which in a normal administration you might think would just move along a trajectory long in place, but also, this very transactional approach, and how it could be good for whatever side you were representing, but it could also be very bad. So you had to bear all that in mind.
I'm curious, this sort of piecemeal approach, is it complicated by the fact that the US doesn't have as many personnel working in Myanmar? Or do you think that that sort of expertise is something that's already present within the US policy ecosystem?
I think it's certainly still there, that level of expertise in the great institutions of state, by which I mean the State Department itself, Treasury, places like that, the universities, the think tanks, etc. I think there's incredible expertise in the US, and despite, the laying off of many people in all of those institutions, I think that core competence is still there. So I'm less worried about that than I would be about the ignoring of that expertise in when it comes to policy, in favour of some sort of arbitrary transaction that might take place. Yeah, so I think my anxiety is not really about the lack of expertise as such, but how it could be, in a sense, leapfrogged, if you like, by policymakers. That was always my concern, and I think the concern of other people as well.
That's fair. I want to turn now to sort of some recent reports that have been coming across, and that's about Bangladesh, which is a neighbor to both India and Myanmar.
Yeah.
And there have been reports of US funding to particular parts, particularly for Rohingya refugees. There's been all sorts of rumors from the fact that the US is planning a development aid corridor to lots of more maybe benign things. And I think my view is that there is no smoke without fire. And so I was wondering if you had heard of anything about what the US is thinking of with the Rohingya refugees or the Rakhine state, particularly with respect to Bangladesh. Just another point of context that I think I want to add is that when I think the Bangladesh head of state went to China earlier last week. He spoke about setting up a separate Rohingya state within the Rakhine state. And he spoke about this to China. And I don't think that it's gone down well with Myanmar on that. So, yeah, just wanted to seek your thoughts on that broadly.
Yeah, extremely complex what's going on in Bangladesh. And I too have heard, I think, every rumor it's possible to imagine relating to Bangladesh and even US policy towards it. But my feeling is that for the US, the issue of the Rohingya in Bangladesh is one that, again, that informed policy elite, if you like, within the US are extremely concerned about the human rights aspects and other aspects of it as well. I cannot imagine that it exercises the Trump administration overly, even if it does the foreign policy establishment. I think there are a number of sort of rumours going around that particularly seem to be suggesting US military involvement, and even exploiting, say, aid corridors and things like that. I would rather doubt it myself, just that I'm not at all convinced that the US would want to step into an environment as complex as that. No doubt, that there's intelligence assets on the ground to find out what's going on, things like that. But yeah, I wouldn't think that the US would be venturing too much beyond that. But clearly, it's an issue of great concern to them. That's not unrelated to the issues then relating to China and that bigger geostrategic aspect. This is all the same region. So I'm sure the US is concerned about it, but I think the complexities of it would probably be beyond the attention, if you like, of the Trump administration itself, even if it wasn't amongst the foreign policy establishment. But even with that group, my feelings would be that they would be viewing matters with grave concern, but certain anxiety about any more direct involvement.
That's fair. And, particularly with respect to Australia and India, how do we see sort of the US's, um, maybe not change, but the US is thinking about Myanmar right now? And, if you were advising either of our governments, and as I suspect you are the Australian government, what would you be recommending to them in the way that we're thinking about the US and its role in the region?
So I think for both Australia and India, real common purpose on this front, which would be keep the US engaged. Don't disengage on this issue, nor many other issues in our regions. So I think actually all three countries, certainly in terms of traditional foreign policy, I think would be, have very much the same ends in mind. So yeah, convincing the US to stay, that it has a role. At the same time, I would imagine that both Australia and India are hedging against the risk of US inattention and ramping up some of our own activities when it comes to Myanmar. And I know that's the case in Australia, and I'm pretty sure it's the case with India as well, which would be something I greatly welcome, I hasten to add, because I think both countries can really provide Myanmar with a lot, actually, on the development front and otherwise. And certainly in Australia, there has been a greater emphasis on Myanmar. More resources have been devoted to the country, including in the wake of the dismantling of USAID, etc. So, so I think the response of India and Australia has been to step up a bit, to seek to continue US engagement, but also, as I said, sort of hedging a little bit about what a US withdrawal might mean.
That's fair. I wonder if this is something that they can bring to Quad because it's already exists as a grouping through which we can think about common interests. Though that is, I'm not sure if it's something that could materialize in the near future.
Oh yeah, I wonder. One of the interesting things in Myanmar is that thinking about the Quad in Myanmar is much more pervasive than I've experienced anywhere else in the world.
Mhm.
Even during the coup and after I was detained, etc., in Myanmar by the junta, it was remarkable how often, by friend and foe alike, how issues relating to the Quad came up. And a feeling, particularly amongst people in the junta, that the Quad was very, very powerful
Mhm.
and directing all sorts of things in the region. Your questions have only just reminded me of it, MCD. I hadn't really thought about that for a long time, but it was unusual the degree to which people amongst the junta in particular saw the US, Australia, India, and Japan as being very much string pullers when it came to our region. But interesting fact.
Yeah. I have one final question for you, and you can tell me what you think.
Yeah.
But I read reports from the last week that the Myanmar junta is now hiring for an international consultant who will take some of their census data and population data and make policy and economic recommendations for them. Considering your history in possibly that role, just hypothetically and just as a lighthearted note, I was
Yeah.
wondering what your advice would be to any international consultant who takes that position.
It would be to be very, very careful and probably have a taxi on standby to get to the airport. Because, I don't think the junta would like bad news. But at the same time, if the consultant was worth anything at all, it's really only bad news that they could deliver, especially on the economy. So I'd have that escape route very much in readiness.
That's good to know. I hope whoever takes that position is listening to us and takes this into consideration. But thank you so much, Sean. Thank you for talking to us today. We hope to have you back in a couple of months to do this again.
It'll be a great pleasure.
That brings us to the end of today's episode with Dr. Sean Turnell. The CNSS broadcast is brought to you by the Center for National Security Studies at Ramaya University. The Center for National Security Studies was founded in 2023 as a multidisciplinary center of excellence for the study, research, and dissemination of subjects of non traditional and traditional national security. CNSS was established by an MOU between MS Ramaya University of Applied Sciences and the Army Training Command. You can find out more about our work at cnss.msruas.ac.in. We will see you next time.